Hello. In this video, we're going to look at the Incoterms for any modes of transportation. So this can be ground, air, it does include marine, but there is going to be another video specifically for just the marine and waterway Incoterms. Let's get started. So just to remind you, there are 11 Incoterms total. There are 7 Incoterms that are related to any mode of transportation. And the 7 Incoterms for any mode of transportation are the Incoterms we are going to be looking at in this video. So the first 4 Incoterms are Ex Works, CPT, so Carriage Paid To, FCA Free Carrier, and CIP, Carriage and Insurance Paid To. Rounding out the top 7, we have DAP Delivered At Place. That is not unloaded. DPU Delivered At Place. This is unloaded. And DDP, which is Delivered Duty Paid. Now, before we get into what each of these Incoterms means and how they are applied when you're shipping internationally, one of the things that you have to remember is the word delivery. So when Incoterms says delivery, they're not talking about the final delivery to the customer. What they're talking about is the point in time where that risk and responsibility changes hands. So when you're looking at these definitions for Incoterms, I want you to remember that delivery does not mean final destination. What it means is when risk and responsibility change hands. So the first term we're going to look at is EXW or Ex Works. Ex Works means that the seller delivers the goods to the buyer when it places the goods at the disposal of the buyer at the named place. So let's go back to what I said about delivery. So what this is saying is when the seller makes the goods available to the buyer to pick up, be it at their factory, at their warehouse, that is the transfer of risk and responsibility. So where it says they are delivering the goods to the buyer, it doesn't mean delivering it to their door. It means making it available. So when the seller makes the goods available at the disposal of the buyer, that is when the transfer of risk and responsibility takes place. So for Ex Works, this happens right at the seller's facility. So all they have to do is pack it up, leave it on the cross dock, and the buyer is responsible for loading the truck, picking it up, and moving it to destination. An example of an Ex Works shipment would be you see something on Facebook Marketplace and you reach out to the seller, you make arrangements to pick it up from their front porch. So the seller packages up whatever it is you've purchased from them, they leave it on the front porch. That's Ex Works. You as the buyer now have to make arrangements to have somebody pick that up, make sure it's loaded correctly into the vehicle, and make sure it gets to your home safely and securely. You've taken on the risk and the responsibility now. Any costs involved with getting it to your home now move to the buyer. All the seller has to do is package it up and leave it on the front porch for you to pick up. Next up, we have FCA or Free Carrier. What free carrier means is the seller delivers the goods to the carrier or another person nominated by the buyer at the seller's premises or another named place. Now, FCA gets a little bit tricky because it can be the situation where the buyer sends a truck and the seller will load the truck, and that is absolutely FCA. It also can be where the seller can load their own truck and have it dropped off at a forwarder's warehouse or the airport on behalf of the buyer. Both of those are considered to be FCA. And so that's why it says there when it is given to the carrier or another named place. So an example of FCA terms are you buy something from a seller, you tell them that you're going to send your truck over to pick it up. Because it's FCA, the seller will load the truck, and once the goods are loaded on the truck, that's where the delivery, quote unquote, takes place. So now the seller no longer has any risk or responsibility for those goods, and the buyer takes on all of the risk or the responsibility. If a box were to fall off the forklift as it was being loaded, it would be the seller's responsibility. If the truck gets into a car accident once it leaves the seller's facility, then it's the buyer's responsibility. CPT, or Carriage Paid To, is a little bit different from what we've seen before. Before, in the first two Incoterms, risk and responsibility transferred in the same place. With CPT, it transfers in different places. So when the seller delivers the goods to the carrier, that's when the risk transfers from the seller to the buyer, but the seller has paid for the transportation up until the destination port. So an example of CPT would be a driver comes to your dock, you load the truck, and he drives away. The risk at that point shifts from the seller to the buyer. So once the seller has loaded the truck and the truck has driven away, that means that's where the risk changes. However, the seller has paid the transportation. So they've paid for the trucking. So anything related to transportation, the seller has covered. If the truck were to get into an accident, the risk would go to the buyer. CIP, Carriage and Insurance Paid To, is very similar to CPT. The only difference with this Incoterm is the seller is buying insurance on behalf of the buyer. So with the previous example, there was an accident and the buyer was responsible. In this case, the seller would have purchased insurance on behalf of the buyer. So if there was an accident, the buyer is now covered based on the seller buying insurance for them. DAP means delivered at place. This means that the seller delivers the goods and they're placed at the disposal of the buyer. So the seller is going to bring the goods to the buyer's door, but they are not going to unload them. They're going to leave it for the buyer to offload. An example of DAP is when you get an Amazon package. The Amazon package gets delivered to your door. It's not brought into your house. It's not handed to you. That is a DAP shipment. DPU, Delivered at Place Unloaded, is as the name suggests. Once the delivery gets to the buyer's door, the seller will be responsible for unloading. An example of a DPU shipment would be if you buy a couch from La-Z-Boy and they bring it into your house, they unpack it, they assemble it, and they take all the garbage out. So that's delivered at place unloaded. And the last one for this bunch is DDP, Delivered Duty Paid. This means the seller bears all the costs and the risks involved with bringing the goods to the final destination, and this includes paying the duties at destination. Up next, Incoterms for sea and waterway.